I was born into a house where silence was the currency and obedience was survival. My father's word was law, and my mother carried his laws like heavy stones in her chest. I was the middle child, the one no one remembered until they needed someone to clean, to watch the younger ones, or to take the blame for what the older ones did. I learned young that in my family, needing something was a sin. When I was 12, I broke a plate while drying dishes. My father didn't shout. He never needed to. He just looked at me, and that look alone froze the air. My mother slapped me before he even had to raise a hand. She thought she was protecting me from his anger, but in truth, she was only rehearsing it. That night, when the house went quiet, I sat in the corner of my room and whispered to myself, "You will learn to need no one." It became my first vow, though I was too young to know what it really meant. By the time I turned 18, the only thing I owned was my stubbornness. I married the first man who promised me something softer. He had a gentle voice, or at least it seemed gentle compared to the thunder I'd grown up with. He told me I was special, that I would never have to worry again. I clung to his words like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. But driftwood doesn't carry you to shore. It only keeps you floating long enough to see how far away the land really is. At first, I believed I had escaped. We moved into a small apartment, cracked walls, thin curtains, neighbors arguing through plaster. But it was ours. For a while, even poverty felt like freedom. I worked in a diner, my hands raw from soap and grease, my feet aching after double shifts. He said he was looking for work, said he just needed time. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that all the years of carrying my family's burdens were finally over. But time stretched and his promises shrank. The man who once said I was special began to say I was ungrateful, that I didn't trust him, that I didn't know how hard it was for him. When he did work, his pay disappeared before it ever touched the rent. Bottles hid in corners, excuses piled higher than the unpaid bills. I was working 2 jobs before I realized I was already carrying him the same way I once carried everyone else. And when the shouting started, I recognized it too well. Different voice, same thunder. I thought I had escaped my father's house, but I had only changed the wallpaper. The first time he hit me, it was with an open hand, and he cried after. He swore he was sorry, swore it was the alcohol, swore it was just stress. I wanted so badly to believe that the man who once whispered I was special was still in there, buried under the anger. So I forgave him once, twice, too many times. Forgiveness became a leash around my own neck. I remember one night when I came home from work, exhausted, smelling of coffee and grease. He was waiting in the dark. He accused me of flirting with customers, of humiliating him, of making him look like less of a man. His words cut deeper than the slap that followed. He told me no one else would ever want me, that without him, I'd be nothing. And in that moment, a part of me almost believed him. Almost. But deep inside, the 12-year-old girl in the corner of her room whispered again, "You will learn to need no one," and something in me hardened. I began saving. Little by little, loose coins from tips, folded bills hidden in the lining of my purse, small acts of rebellion he never noticed. I told myself that one day I would buy my freedom. I didn't know how or when, but I held on to that secret like it was a seed in winter. Still, leaving wasn't simple. Every time I thought I had enough, some crisis came crashing down. A broken pipe, an empty fridge, his demands for money he didn't earn, and always his words reminding me that I was weak, that I couldn't survive without him. I carried those words like chains, but inside me, I also carried that vow. The turning point came the night he staggered home drunk, angrier than usual. He accused me of hiding money, of betraying him. He tore through drawers, dumped out my purse, ripped the cushions from the couch. I stood there trembling, watching him destroy the little home we had. And for the first time, I realized something. He was afraid. Not of me, not of losing me, but of standing on his own. He needed me. He depended on me. And the moment I saw that truth, a fire lit inside me. They had all thought, the family I grew up in, the man I married, that I was the one who needed them, that I would always bend, always carry, always serve. But what if the truth was the opposite? What if they were the ones leaning on me all along? That night, I didn't cry, I didn't plead. I just stood still, watching him rage, and I thought, you are the weak one, not me. It would still take years and a trail of wounds I hadn't yet imagined, but in that moment, the seed I'd buried in myself began to crack open. I would not belong to anyone. I would not depend. I would stand. I didn't leave right away. People like to imagine courage as a single moment, one dramatic decision where you throw everything into a suitcase and slam the door behind you. But courage, for me, came in crumbs. Tiny choices, quiet rebellions, the kind you make with your teeth clenched and your lips sealed. I kept working, kept saving. The money I hid became my secret garden, buried in envelopes, under floorboards, inside the hollow of an old lamp, tucked inside empty coffee tins. He never thought to look there. He was too busy believing he controlled me. That arrogance was my camouflage. The less he expected me to stand on my own, the more space I had to prepare for it. But life has a cruel way of testing every secret plan. When I found out I was pregnant, all the scraps of strength I had gathered scattered like paper in the wind. A baby, a child who would grow up under the roof of this man in the shadow of his storms. For weeks, I could barely eat, barely breathe. My coworkers noticed the weight melting off me, the pale circles under my eyes, but I brushed them off with lies. I'm just tired. I've got the flu. What I had was fear, thick, choking fear. I thought about my own mother, how she tried to protect me from my father's wrath by becoming his shadow. How she bent herself into shapes she didn't recognize just to keep us fed, to keep us alive. And I hated her for it back then. But as I pressed a hand to my belly, I understood her in a way I never wanted to. The impossible calculation, do you stay and suffer, hoping to shield your child from the worst of it? Or do you run and risk leaving them hungry, homeless, alone? When my daughter was born, I swore two things over her tiny head. The first, she would never think that violence was love. The second, she would never hear me beg. I would protect her with the last breath in my lungs, even if it meant tearing myself apart. At first, he softened. He held the baby awkwardly, looked at her like she was a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. For a while, he seemed calmer, as if fatherhood had sedated the rage. I let myself hope. Oh, how foolish that hope was. Because soon the bottles returned, the excuses thickened, and the storms rumbled louder than ever. Only this time they didn't break over me alone. They shook the walls of the crib. They rattled the tiny windows of her world. One night, when she was barely 3, he shouted so loud she woke screaming. I scooped her into my arms, my heart hammering, and I felt her tiny hands clinging to my shirt, shaking. That was the moment I knew my vow could no longer wait. My daughter's terror was the mirror I needed. She was living the childhood I swore I'd never repeat. And I thought, if I stay, I am no better than my mother. If I stay, I am the same. I began to plan in earnest. Every shift at the diner was not just work, but escape. Every coin dropped into my secret hiding places was a step out the door. I befriended women at work, learned which shelters existed in the city, which charities helped single mothers, where the churches kept food pantries. I kept notes folded small enough to tuck inside my bra, where even his hands never searched. But just when I thought I had enough courage, something, or rather someone, pulled it away. My sister. We had barely spoken since I left home, but one day she appeared at the diner, hair neatly pinned, lipstick perfect, wearing the smugness of a woman who never let herself get dirty. She sat at the counter, stirring coffee she didn't drink, and finally leaned in. I hear things aren't going well for you. Her voice carried that blend of pity and satisfaction that only siblings can master. I wanted to throw the hot coffee in her face. Instead, I smiled, brittle. We're fine, she smirked. You could always come home, if you need help. Help. The word hung in the air like a noose. Going back to that house, to my father's silence and my mother's servitude, would have been death by slow suffocation. They would have loved to see me crawl back. They would have loved to remind me that I couldn't make it on my own. That night, I cried in the bathroom with the faucet running so he wouldn't hear. I cried because part of me wanted to take her offer, to collapse into the arms of someone else's strength, to stop fighting for just one day. But the stronger part of me, the vow that had lived in me since I was 12, refused. I would not give them the satisfaction. I would not crawl back. Still, the pressure mounted. Bills stacked higher. My daughter grew, and so did her needs: shoes, medicine, school supplies. He grew meaner, angrier at every shadow, every imagined betrayal. I worked myself to the bone, and the more I provided, the more he depended. And I saw it again, the truth I had glimpsed that night when he tore apart the house. They thought I depended on them, my father, my husband, even my sister with her smug offers of help, but they were the ones leaning on me. Without my labor, my forgiveness, my silence, their entire worlds would collapse. I was the pillar holding them all up, and they didn't even know it. The realization was both a burden and a liberation. A burden because it meant there was no safety net waiting for me. A liberation because if they needed me more than I needed them, then maybe, just maybe, I could walk away. The first time I tried, I failed. I had packed a small bag, tucked it behind the trash in the alley near work. My plan was to pick up my daughter after my shift and head straight for a shelter. But that night, he showed up at the diner, drunk and demanding. He made a scene, shouting across the counter, telling everyone I was his, that no one would ever take me from him. The shame burned hot under my skin. My coworkers stared at me with pity, the same pity I had once seen in my sister's eyes. I couldn't do it, not that night. I went home with him, clutching my daughter close, hating myself for the weakness. But seeds don't stop growing just because a storm knocks them flat. I had failed once, yes, but the seed was already sprouting inside me, and I knew next time I wouldn't fail. The second time I tried to leave, I did not tell a soul. Not my coworkers, not my sister, not even the kind woman at the church pantry who once pressed my hand and whispered, "You don't have to stay." I had learned my lesson. Silence was safer. Silence and careful planning. I chose a night in late autumn. The air had turned sharp, the kind that cuts your lungs with every breath. He was passed out on the couch, reeking of beer, his snores rattling like broken machinery. My daughter, 5 now, slept in her small bed, clutching a threadbare teddy bear. I moved like a shadow, lifting her gently, whispering that we were going on an adventure. I carried nothing but a duffel bag with clothes, the last envelope of money, and the scrap of paper where I had written the address of a shelter across town. When the taxi pulled away from the curb, I remember staring at the back of his slumped body through the window, his arm dangling, his mouth open, and thinking, "You'll wake up and realize your crutch is gone. You'll finally know how weak you are without me." That thought should have brought me peace. Instead, my stomach churned with guilt, with terror, with the echo of his words, "You can't survive without me." At the shelter, they gave us cots in a large room that smelled of bleach and weary women. My daughter's eyes were wide, scared but curious, and I tried to smile for her. I whispered bedtime stories, my voice trembling, as other mothers coughed softly in the dark. I told myself, this is freedom. This is the first step. But freedom doesn't feel like freedom when you're still looking over your shoulder. He found me within a week. I'll never forget the pounding on the shelter door, his voice bellowing my name, the way my daughter clung to me like a terrified animal. The staff turned him away, threatened to call the police, but I knew then escape was not a single act. It was a war, and wars are fought in battles, not victories. So we kept moving, from shelter to shelter, couch to couch. Some friends let us stay, but not for long. Pity wears thin when mouths to feed multiply. I worked every shift I could grab, my feet bleeding, my hands blistered, while strangers raised their eyebrows at the sight of a tired woman dragging a child from place to place. And yet, in the middle of all that chaos, there was a flicker of something new. My daughter laughed more freely when he wasn't around. She began to draw pictures, me and her, hand in hand, under a sun that finally looked like a sun instead of a black scribble. Those drawings were my fuel, proof that leaving, no matter how hard, was better than staying. The twist came when the law stepped in, not to protect me, but to question me. He filed for custody. Imagine the gall of it, a man who spent nights drowning in alcohol, who raised his fists more often than he raised his child, suddenly standing in a courtroom declaring himself the better parent. And the system, oh, the system listened. They looked at me, a tired waitress with no stable address, no savings to speak of, clothes that smelled of fryer oil. And then they looked at him, cleaned up for the hearing, sober for once, wearing a pressed shirt he probably borrowed from his brother. They listened to him speak of family and responsibility while his voice dripped with lies. I stood there, shaking, but I did not beg. I remembered my vow. I spoke plainly. Your Honor, I have kept this child alive. I have fed her, clothed her, comforted her through every nightmare. I have worked 3 jobs so she could sleep under a roof. He has done none of that. He has harmed me, and he has terrified her. I thought the truth would be enough. It wasn't. The court granted him visitation. Supervise, they said, as though that word erased the risk, as though supervision could undo years of fear. The night I told my daughter, she cried herself hoarse. "Mommy, don't let him take me." I held her until my arms ached, and in that moment, I hated every man, every system, every person who thought they knew better. They all assumed I was fragile, dependent, incapable of raising her alone. They saw only what I lacked, not what I had survived. And yet, I refused to crumble. I told my daughter the truth. They don't know us. They don't know how strong we are. Every visitation was a battle. I'd sit outside the supervised center, staring at the doors, waiting for her to come back out. Sometimes she was quiet, withdrawn. Sometimes she was trembling. Once she asked, "Why does he say you'll come back to him? Why does he tell me that?" And my heart split wide open. I realized then that leaving him was not enough. I had to dismantle his power piece by piece, not just over me, but over her. I had to show her that dependence was a lie he needed to survive, not a truth we had to carry. And so, little by little, I built a life from ashes. We found a small apartment, 1 room, peeling paint, leaky pipes, but it was ours. I found steadier work, not glamorous, not easy, but steady. My daughter enrolled in school. We had second-hand furniture, mismatched dishes, and a radio that only played 2 stations. But every night when we locked the door, it was our door. No shouting, no fists, no fear. Still, he hovered. Letters, phone calls, the occasional shadow outside our building, always reminding me that in his mind I was still tethered, that he still believed I would collapse without him. And sometimes, when the bills piled high, when the fridge was nearly empty, when exhaustion weighed me down so heavily I could barely stand, I almost believed it myself. But then my daughter would slip her hand into mine and whisper, "We're okay, Mommy." And I knew I wasn't standing alone. I was standing for her, with her, and together we were stronger than every man who had ever mistaken my silence for weakness. They thought I'd depend on them. But every day, every hard-won breath of survival proved the opposite. The war wasn't over, but I had survived the first battles, and survival, in its own quiet way, was victory. The years that followed were not easy, but they were mine. Survival became routine, and routine, strangely, became a kind of peace. I woke before dawn, made my daughter's lunch, walked her to school, and hurried to my shift. The work was back-breaking, the pay insulting, but each coin I earned was a coin no one could take credit for but me. Every blister on my hand was proof I was standing on my own 2 feet. Still, the shadow of dependence lingered. My family wrote letters, thinly veiled in judgment. "You could always come home." My sister left messages, sweet poison wrapped in pity. "Don't be stubborn. You can't raise a child alone. Don't make her suffer for your pride." Even he, my ex, found ways to whisper through cracks in the wall. Phone calls from unknown numbers, letters slid under the door, promises that he had changed. They circled me like vultures, waiting for the day I would collapse, waiting for me to crawl back and prove them right. I never gave them that satisfaction. Instead, I began to dream bigger than survival. One night, as my daughter worked through her homework at the kitchen table, I found myself staring at her pencil scratches and realizing how much I had forgotten. I had left school young, swallowed by work and marriage, but watching her learn awakened something in me. Why should education belong only to her? Why should knowledge be one more thing I had been denied? So, at 42, I enrolled in night classes. I sat in classrooms filled with kids half my age, my hands trembling as I clutched a cheap notebook, my cheeks burning when the teacher called my name. I had forgotten how to be a student. But each fact I learned, each essay I wrote, was another brick in the wall I was building between myself and dependence. It wasn't easy. I worked mornings at the diner, evenings cleaning offices, and nights hunched over textbooks. I would fall asleep with my face pressed to pages, only to wake at dawn and do it all again. My body ached constantly, but my daughter, oh, she glowed with pride. She bragged to her teachers that her mom was in school too. That pride gave me fuel when my bones wanted to quit. And yet, just as I began to feel stronger, the past clawed at me again. One evening, as I walked home from class, I saw him, leaning against a lamppost, cigarette dangling, eyes tracking me with that old, dangerous familiarity. My chest tightened, but I kept walking, forcing myself not to quicken my pace. He called out, voice slurred, words dripping like venom. "You think you're better than me now? You think you don't need me? You'll come back. You always do." I didn't answer. I walked into our apartment, locked the door, and held my daughter as if the sound of his voice might have seeped through the walls. That night I shook, not because I believed him, but because I didn't. For the first time, I realized his words held no power unless I gave them power. He was the ghost of a man I once carried, and I would not carry him again. Still, the law tied us together through visitation. I hated those days, hated watching my daughter's light dim when she came home. She was older now, sharper. She asked hard questions. Why does he lie? Why does he tell me you'll forgive him? I wanted to shield her, but I also wanted her to see the truth, that strength wasn't pretending the past never happened. Strength was standing in spite of it. So I told her plainly, he says those things because he's afraid. He depended on me, not the other way around. Don't ever believe otherwise. That was another turning point, not in my battle with him, but in my relationship with her. I began to realize that everything I endured wasn't just about me anymore. My daughter was watching, learning. If I faltered, if I crawled back, she would grow up believing that women were meant to bend until they broke. But if I stood tall, if I finished my classes, if I carved out a life with nothing but grit and stubbornness, then she would learn something else entirely. The day I earned my certification, she was in the audience clapping with tears in her eyes. I was 45, dressed in a borrowed gown, holding a piece of paper that meant more to me than any wedding vow I had ever spoken. That night, I cooked us a meal with ingredients I could barely afford, and we laughed until our bellies hurt. For the first time, our little apartment felt not just like shelter, but like home. But life has a way of testing new strength. Within months, my mother grew ill. Word came from my sister, her voice clipped, almost gleeful, as she said, "She's asking for you." I hadn't seen my parents in decades. I had built my life on the vow never to return. Yet the news pulled at me. My daughter urged me to go. She was nearly grown by then, strong in ways I hadn't noticed until that moment. She said, "Mom, you don't owe them anything, but maybe you owe yourself." So I went. Not to forgive, not to forget, but to see, to measure the distance between the girl I was and the woman I had become. Walking into that house again was like stepping into a graveyard. The furniture sagged with age, the air heavy with dust and memories. My father sat silent in his chair, frail but still commanding, with those eyes that had once frozen me. My mother lay in bed, a shell of herself, her voice barely a whisper. She reached for my hand and said, "You did it. You stood without us." I hadn't expected that. I had carried anger for so long that her words pierced me deeper than any slap she had ever given. For a moment, I almost broke. But then I realized, even in her dying breath, she admitted what they all feared most, that I had proven them wrong. When I left that house, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The girl who once vowed to need no one had kept her promise. And now, the woman I had become understood something even deeper. Standing alone didn't mean being empty. It meant being whole. By the time I turned 50, the word alone no longer frightened me. I had spent so much of my life surrounded by people who called themselves family, but fed on my silence, my labor, my submission. Compared to that, solitude felt like clean air after years of breathing smoke. My daughter grew into a woman faster than I was ready for. One day she was sketching suns and stick figures. The next, she was packing for college. I had raised her with the kind of love I had once believed didn't exist, a love that never struck, never belittled, never demanded silence. And still, when she hugged me goodbye at the bus station, I felt my chest cave in. I smiled until she was gone, then went home and wept like a child. Not because I feared for her. No, I knew she was stronger than I ever was at her age, but because for the first time in decades, the apartment was quiet. My entire adult life had been a fight, first against him, then against poverty, then against the system. And through it all, my daughter had been my reason, my anchor. Without her laughter in the next room, who was I? That was the question that haunted me. For years, I had defined myself by what I resisted, by whom I protected. Now I had to define myself by what I chose. So I chose to keep learning. I enrolled in more classes, this time in literature, history, anything that had once been denied to me. I devoured books, filling my nights with voices wiser and kinder than those I grew up with. I wrote essays, timid at first, then bold, until one of my instructors encouraged me to publish. I laughed at the suggestion. What did I have to offer the world? But she insisted. You've lived a life most people only read about in fiction. Write it. So I did. In scraps at first, on napkins at the diner during breaks, in notebooks bought at thrift stores. I wrote about growing up under silence, about the marriage that wasn't love, about the nights in shelters and the mornings in classrooms. I wrote the words I had swallowed for decades. And slowly, the act of writing became more than memory. It became pure. Each sentence was another weight lifted from my chest. Each page was proof that my story belonged to me, not to those who had tried to bury it. But just as I began to feel settled in this new chapter, life twisted again. My ex resurfaced, older, weaker, but no less bitter. He had burned through jobs, relationships, whatever scraps of goodwill he had left. And now, in his decline, he sought me out. He appeared at my door one afternoon, leaning on a cane, his voice a raspy echo of the thunder it once was. "Help me," he said. "You're all I've got." The audacity of it nearly knocked the air from my lungs. Decades of torment, of fists and words designed to break me. And now he stood there, expecting me to catch him as he fell. As if I were still the girl who believed her worth was measured by what she endured. I looked at him, and for the first time I felt nothing. No rage, no fear, not even pity. Only clarity. "You thought I'd depend on you," I said, my voice steady. "But you were the one who couldn't survive without me, and you still can't." I closed the door. That moment crystallized something I had been circling all my life. Dependence isn't just chains others place on you. It's the lie they tell themselves to avoid facing their own weakness. He needed me to believe I was helpless so he could pretend he wasn't. But I wasn't helpless. I never had been. Still, I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights when loneliness pressed heavy, when I longed for a voice in the next room, a hand to hold. People imagine strength as a constant flame, but the truth is it flickers. Some nights it nearly went out, and yet I never went back. Instead, I built community in smaller, quieter ways. At the library, I read stories aloud to children whose mothers were working late shifts, just as I once had. At the shelter, I volunteered, serving meals to women who sat with the same trembling posture I remembered all too well. I didn't tell them my full story. Sometimes survival means guarding your truths, but I let my presence speak for itself. If they looked at me and saw proof that survival was possible, then that was enough. And through it all, my daughter grew, thrived, lived without the chains I had carried. She called often, visited when she could. Once, after a long silence on the phone, she said softly, "Mom, you taught me how to stand on my own, but I don't want you to always stand alone." Her words pierced me in a way my mother's deathbed confession had years earlier. They reminded me that standing alone and being alone are not the same thing. Independence doesn't forbid love. It only demands that love be chosen freely, not endured out of fear. In my 50s, I began to let people in, not to lean on them, not to be carried, but to share the weight of living. Friendships, laughter, even the tentative brush of romance with a kind man I met in class. I didn't marry him. I didn't need to. What we shared was companionship, not chains. And for the first time, I understood that strength isn't the absence of others. It's the refusal to vanish inside them. But life, as always, had one last test for me. When my father finally died, my sister called, her voice brittle. "It's done," she said. "He's gone. Mother too. The house is ours now." She spoke as if it were an inheritance, a prize. She asked if I wanted to claim my share. I laughed. For decades, that house had been my prison. The only inheritance it offered was silence, fear, and servitude. I told her she could keep it. She sputtered, furious, but I hung up with a peace I had never known before, because the truth was clear at last. I had no use for what they left behind. I had built a life they could never touch, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. You know, people often ask me now, women especially, how did you do it? How did you stand alone after so much was taken from you? And I always smile, because the truth is complicated. I didn't just stand alone one day like some heroine in a book. I crawled, I stumbled, I fell down more times than I can count. But each time I did, I got back up a little quicker, a little steadier, until standing alone didn't feel like loneliness anymore. It felt like freedom. I think about those years when everyone thought I'd be broken without them. My husband, with his smirk, telling me I'd be nothing without his name. My family, whispering that I couldn't survive without their charity. My so-called friends, quietly betting on my failure. They all thought dependency was my only destiny. But what they didn't understand was that once you've walked through the fire, once you've survived humiliation, poverty, and betrayal, there's a kind of steel that grows inside you. And no one can take that away. I built a new rhythm for my life. Mornings no longer filled with dread, but with the soft ritual of coffee and the sight of sunlight stretching across my kitchen floor. Afternoons where I read or planted flowers or wrote letters to people who had long since drifted away. Nights where silence was no longer terrifying, but sacred, a silence I owned, not one imposed on me by cruelty. There were moments, of course, when grief visited me like an old, unwelcome friend. Birthdays where no one called. Holidays spent at a small table for one. Nights when I woke up gasping from nightmares of hands gripping my throat. But even then, I discovered something. Grief only has as much power as you feed it. And I chose to feed something else. Hope, patience, gratitude for the smallest victories. It wasn't some grand transformation. It was 1,000 tiny choices. Choosing to get out of bed when my body wanted to give up. Choosing to eat even when my stomach turned with sorrow. Choosing to forgive myself for not seeing the red flags sooner, for being too trusting, too soft. Choosing, ultimately, to stop needing approval from those who had proven they would never give it. And now, as I sit here in the quiet of my little home, I realize something remarkable. I am no longer afraid, not of being alone, not of their judgment, not of starting over, because I already did the hardest thing, stood alone when the world expected me to crawl back. I carry my scars like a second skin, and I don't try to hide them anymore. They tell my story better than words ever could. They say she was hurt, she was betrayed, she was left for nothing. And yet, she built a life no one could control but her. So when I tell you I stood alone, don't imagine me as some statue, unshakable and cold. Imagine me instead as a woman who learned how to bend with the wind without breaking, who learned how to dance in an empty room, who learned that solitude can be softer, kinder, and infinitely stronger than the wrong kind of company. They thought I'd depend on them. They thought I'd collapse without their approval, their money, their names, their crumbs of affection. But here I am, breathing, laughing sometimes, crying, yes, but on my own terms, living and standing, always standing, alone